the screams echoed through the dark hallways of Rikers Island. A young inmate was being dragged by two correction officers, his wrists bound tight with handcuffs. His face was bruised, his lip bleeding, but it wasn't just the pain that terrified him, it was the fear that he would not come back alive. Other prisoners banged on their cell doors, shouting, some in anger, others in warning. Inside the world of Rikers, moments like this were not rare. They were the deadly secrets that lived in the shadows of America's most notorious jail. And on this night, one secret was about to explode into the open. The inmate's name was Kalief Browder. He was only 16 when he first entered Rikers, accused of stealing a backpack. He never had a trial, never had his day in court. Yet here he was, trapped in the system for years, forgotten in a place where survival was not about truth or innocence, it was about power, gangs, and luck. On this night, guards marched him toward solitary confinement, a punishment cell known by inmates as the box. But what would happen inside that box was far worse than punishment. It was isolation so deep, so crushing, that it broke men from the inside out. The story of Rikers Island is not one story, it is hundreds of stories stitched together by violence, corruption, and fear. Built on an island in the East River of New York City, the jail complex was meant to hold detainees temporarily as they waited for trial. But in reality, men and women were left to rot there for years. At its peak, more than 10,000 people lived inside those walls, making it one of the largest jail systems in the country. Most of them had not even been convicted of a crime. They were simply waiting, sometimes for years, for their cases to move forward. Every day inside Rikers was a battle. Gangs controlled entire units, deciding who could eat, who could sleep, and who would bleed. Correction officers were supposed to maintain order, but many were accused of adding to the chaos. Reports of beatings, corruption, and even smuggling contraband became part of the jail's reputation. For a young man like Kalief, who had no gang affiliation and no protection, every corner was a threat. He was jumped in the cafeteria, beaten in the shower, and left bruised in the recreation yard. To survive, he learned to keep his back against the wall, his eyes sharp, and his mouth shut. But Rikers was not just violent, it was slow. Time crawled inside. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Kalief's family begged for his release, but the court system moved like molasses. Bail was set too high, and his mother could not afford it. So he stayed locked inside, as his case stalled again and again. Each time he thought he might be free, another delay pushed him back into the nightmare. Still, not every day was blood and fear. There were quieter moments, small glimpses of humanity. Inmates joked in the yard, sharing stories of life outside. Some traded candy for favors, while others crafted makeshift weights from water bottles to stay strong. For a few minutes, laughter would cut through the tension, and the jail almost felt normal. But the calm never lasted. Like a storm waiting to break, violence was always just around the corner. One afternoon, Kalief sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall. The cell was hot, the air thick with the smell of sweat and metal. His mind drifted back to the world outside, to his mother's cooking, to riding bikes with his brothers, to a life that seemed so far away now. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed down the tier. Two inmates were fighting, fists flying, bodies slamming against steel doors. Guards rushed in, swinging batons, spraying pepper spray that burned the air. Chaos erupted, and in the middle of Kalief pressed his face into the thin mattress, coughing, praying he would not be dragged into it too. The fights were constant, but what made Rikers truly deadly was the mix of violence and despair. Some inmates gave up hope entirely. Stories spread of men hanging themselves in their cells, unable to endure another day. Others lashed out at guards or fellow prisoners, knowing they would be punished, but feeling they had nothing left to lose. It was a cycle of brutality that fed itself. The jail was a pressure cooker, and every explosion left scars, on bodies, on minds, and on families outside the walls. Kalief tried to stay strong, but the weight of solitary confinement pressed on him. Locked alone in a small cell for 23 hours a day, he counted cracks in the wall, whispered to himself, and tried to hold on to reality. The silence was crushing, broken only by the distant echoes of shouting from other cells. Sometimes he would bang on the door just to prove to himself he still existed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and with each passing hour, the box carved away pieces of him he could never get back, and then came the night when it all boiled over. Guards stormed his cell after accusing him of breaking a rule. The door flew open with a loud crash, and several officers charged inside. Kalief was thrown to the ground, his head pressed hard against the concrete floor. He felt fists strike his ribs, boots slam into his side. He gasped for air, but the blows kept coming. Outside, other inmates screamed, banging on their doors, but no one could stop what was happening. Kalief's vision blurred, his body went limp, and for a moment, he thought this might be the end, but just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The guards dragged him out of the cell, his body aching, his mind spinning. They pulled him down the long, dim hallway toward another punishment cell. The other inmates watched in silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Everyone knew what this meant. Some whispered that once you were taken like that, you might never come back. The steel door slammed shut behind him, leaving Kalief in the darkness. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, and his mind raced with a single question: what would they do to him next? The steel door clanged shut, sealing Kalief inside a new cell. The space was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet. A dim light flickered above, casting long shadows against the concrete walls. The air was stale and smelled of sweat and bleach. Kalief's ribs ached from the beating, and his face throbbed where it had struck the floor. He sat on the thin mattress, his chest rising and falling quickly, trying to steady himself. The silence pressed against his ears, heavier than the chains on his wrists. Hours passed, though time meant little inside Rikers. The jail was a place where days blended together, where the outside world felt like a dream. Kalief closed his eyes, thinking of his mother's face, her promise that she was still fighting for him. But inside these walls, hope was fragile. It cracked easily under the weight of fear. The next morning, guards pushed a tray of food through the slot in his door. Cold oatmeal, a bruised apple, and a cup of water. He stared at it for a long time. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but his mind told him not to eat. He had heard stories of spoiled food, of sickness spreading through trays. Still, his body won the fight. He lifted the spoon and forced himself to eat, each bite tasting like cardboard. Not every moment was violence. Some days dragged by in quiet monotony. Kalief would pace back and forth in the tiny cell, counting steps until he hit the wall, then turning back again. He sang songs softly to himself, whispering verses from childhood just to keep his mind from unraveling. Sometimes he pressed his ear to the door, listening for voices. When another inmate shouted from a nearby cell, Kalief would answer. Their conversations were short, broken by distance and metal, but it was enough to remind him that he was not entirely alone. But peace inside Rikers was never real. It was like a thin sheet of glass, ready to shatter at any moment. One afternoon, Kalief was taken from his cell for a short walk in the yard. The air outside was sharp, the sky cloudy, but it was freedom compared to the box. As he walked, two older inmates approached him. Their eyes were cold, and their words carried weight. "You need protection," one of them said, his voice low. "Join us, and you'll be safe. Say no, and you're on your own." Kalief felt his stomach twist. He knew what it meant. Joining a gang could shield him from beatings, but it would also mean following orders, fighting, smuggling, even stabbing if told to. Saying no meant staying a target. He kept his head down and mumbled, "I'll think about it." The men walked away, but the message was clear. At Rikers, there was no such thing as neutrality. That night, Kalief lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thought of freedom, of school, of riding his bike through the Bronx. He thought of how his life had shrunk to a cell, a tray of food, and the threat of violence. He told himself he would not break. He would not let Rikers change who he was. But the walls closed in tighter with every passing day. Weeks turned into months. Court dates were delayed again and again. Each time his lawyer came, Kalief's heart leapt with hope, only to sink when told he had to wait longer. The system seemed designed to crush him slowly, to wear him down until he gave up. Some days he thought about pleading guilty, even though he hadn't done what they said. A guilty plea might mean going home sooner. But deep inside, he clung to his innocence like a lifeline. I didn't do it, he whispered to himself. I didn't do it. And then, one day, the storm returned. Kalief was being escorted back to his cell when another inmate lunged at him in the hallway. A fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing against the wall. The attacker, a tall man covered in tattoos, shouted curses as he swung again. Guards rushed forward, but instead of pulling the attacker away, they pinned both men to the floor. Kalief struggled, trying to explain he wasn't fighting back, but his voice was drowned by chaos. The guard's baton struck him across the shoulder, pain exploding through his body. Another blow landed on his leg. He cried out, the sound swallowed by the noise of boots and shouts. Inmates banged on their doors, some cheering, others shouting in protest. The hallway was filled with the smell of sweat and fear. Kalief's vision blurred. The world tilted as hands yanked him up, dragging him once again. His body felt heavy, his mind spinning, but one thought cut through the haze: they weren't taking him back to his cell. They were taking him somewhere else. The path twisted down a darker corridor, one he had never seen before. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the air grew colder with each step. Guards whispered to each other, their voices low, their faces hard. Kalief's heart pounded as dread clawed at him, and then the door opened. What lay beyond was not the cell he expected. It was a place whispered about among inmates, a place no one wanted to go. Kalief's breath caught in his throat as the guards shoved him forward, and the heavy door slammed shut behind him. What he saw inside would change everything.